It's interesting because medical science, I'm a scientist. I have nothing against science at all. And I understand why we do the things we do. Um, Einstein said, and many scientists before him, that said, unless something can be empirically proven through empirical data and observation, it remains yet a theory and not a fact, not a law. That's the law of science. So the medicine is a science. So the American Medical Association, amongst most medical organizations in the world, they we don't attribute any phenomena associated with our discipline of study to things beyond empirical study, which would be spirituality. So we can't say, well, we observed this phenomena that we never observed, must have been a spiritual event. Well, that's speculation. Must have been a spiritual event. That you can remain as meaningless speculation, but it can never be established as a basis or a reason. It can never be established as in the law of causality because it's not empirical. Right? We can't prove or disprove the existence of God, though I can tell you I know what I know in my heart, and nobody can disprove the existence of God to me. They don't entertain for this. So you will hear, in fact, you could look up in medical text the phrase spontaneous remission. There are people that are cured from diseases of all different types, rarely from something called spontaneous remission. There are recorded cases of spontaneous remission from incurable cancer, from terminal cancer, from terminal diseases, from alcoholism. They are rare, and they have just more frequently, there's quite a few of them, started documenting them. In fact, there's a society that studies spontaneous remission, and I believe it's a medical society. So, when I left that hospital with a great passion to help people that were suffering as I suffered, because I remembered the suffering that I went through, I remember the bleeding, and I remembered a horrible death, a cold, horrible, bloody death. And I want to help, still want to help greatly people that are suffering from this disease. I wanted to learn as much as I could about spirituality, about healing, about metaphysics, about the science of alcoholism, as I possibly could. And so I started reading about the spontaneous remission, and that's clearly what I had. But why does the AMA use spontaneous remission? Well, remission is an interesting choice for words. Because when something's in remission, it's not cured, is it? Well, how can you say something's cured if you don't understand what caused the cure? You can't, so they don't. If a disease goes into remission, I'll take breast cancer. Well, she suffered from breast cancer, but it's in remission. That's a very good thing. It's a great thing. It's not a perfect thing, though. I know women that have breast cancer in remission, and for many of them, there's a tremendous fear. Because like a lion in its den, it can roar its ugly head back. Spontaneous means it somehow seemed to happen over a very brief period of time. Spontaneous remission is an inexplicable, as-of-date medical phenomena that caused the disease to recede into remission. And I wanted to find other people who had had a spontaneous remission from alcoholism, just like I've read about people who have had a spontaneous remission of other diseases. They seek out people that have had a similar experience because there's so much to try to understand. There's such a sense of awe and mystery associated with it. So an interesting story about synchronicity. Synchronicity is that when two seemingly unrelated events happen to flash into your life at the same time for some reason that can only be ascribed to our destinies and an act of providence and not coincidence, because I'm one of those people that don't believe there's no coincidences in the universe. So I was seeking out a person that had undergone spontaneous remission. And in Alcoholics Anonymous, there's different forms for this. You read from books and reference material. Oftentimes there's sharing sessions. People will share their story. And I've heard hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories. And about a year and a half after my spontaneous remission, somebody told their story. It was a guy I didn't know. And I'll call him Dan. And Dan started telling his story. And Dan had a spontaneous remission from alcoholism. Interesting. It's the first person I heard. I made a point, I got to talk to Dan after this meeting. Interestingly enough, Dan had cirrhosis. That's what killed me. Interestingly enough, Dan saw the same medical doctors at the University of Maryland Medical Center that I saw for his liver disease. In a small world, he talked about that. I said, wow, there are people like this. This one's amazingly close. So I introduced myself after the meeting, and I said, hi, I'm Jim Spina. I said, I'm really interested in your story because we seem to have a pretty common thread that's not that common. And he said, Spina. That's an odd name. And by the way, I live in Annapolis now, so this meeting was around the Annapolis area. That's an odd name. I said, well, it's Italian. He goes, yeah, but you don't hear it a lot. He goes, there was a Spina in my hometown. I said, really? I said, it's unusual. I said, well, where did you grow up? And he said, Dunkirk, New York. That's the same town I grew up in, Dunkirk, New York. It's a small town. It's about 50 miles outside of Buffalo, New York, on the shores of Lake Erie. I think there are probably about 10,000 people in Dunkirk, New York. And he said, yeah, Spina. He says, there was a guy named Jimmy Spina. He used to build houses, remodel kitchens and bathrooms. He had his own band. That's my father. He says, furthermore, he says, my mother dated him. He says, any relation to you? Now, this guy that I meet in a 2-year search to see somebody that had undergone spontaneous remission, had the same condition I had, cirrhosis, went to the same doctors from the same hospital, is from the same hometown, and my father remodeled their house, their kitchen and bathroom, and dated his mother when they were in high school. Now, that's not synchronicity. I can't tell you what is. Coincidence? Give me a break. What's the statistical probability that I would find somebody whose mother dated my father when I was 1,000 miles away from a person I didn't even know and asked a question about spontaneous remission? We've been friends ever since, and we share a lot of stories, and there's way more in common than that. It's almost like we've led parallel lives. We voluntarily went to the same rehabilitation center, a reasonably famous alcohol rehabilitation center, prayed in the same chapel, said the same prayer to the same crucifix. That's synchronicity. There's a lot to be understood about this world that we don't understand, but sometimes it presents itself simply as it is. That was a blessing from God, inserted into our lives at exactly the right time, in the right moment, for both of us, to continue the provision of blessing that He gave both of us, so that we could continue to help other people who are suffering from this horrible, murderous disease. I really appreciate you sharing this time with me. Thanks. If you have any questions or comments, if you've had any experiences about synchronicity or struggling with recovery, alcoholism, spontaneous remission, I'd love to hear about them.